In this lecture, we will begin the discussion of the third act of the biblical drama. We've looked at the first act, creation, the second act, the fall into sin, and its immediate aftermath. Well, the third act of the drama is the story of redemption, and this basically is most of the Bible from the end of, basically beginning in Genesis at the end of chapter 11 through Revelation chapter 20. Now, we've said that one of the themes of how God works is God is the initiator. He acts through his grace, and then people respond in faith. And that's how he begins the drama of redemption. He begins by choosing one man, Abraham, to begin his specific plan for redeeming the entire world. And this occurred, Abraham lived approximately 2,000 years before Jesus Christ came onto the scene. And he was called out of his home in Ur of the Chaldeans, which would be in modern-day Iraq. Now, God told him, I want you to leave your home, leave your family, and go to a place where I will show you. And so he did, and there were some stops along the way. He lived with his father Terah, and he left Ur, but then remained in Iraq for some period of time. But then his father died, and he finally resumed the journey to what later on would become Israel. And so they stayed in Haran, a town in modern-day Iraq. So again, notice something here. God initiates, Abram obeys, but he only obeys partially, and he didn't get all the way to the land that God showed him. But then his father dies, and then after Terah, Abraham's father, died, God announced what is known as the Abrahamic Covenant. Now, the Abrahamic Covenant is repeated using different words in Genesis 12, 13, 15, 17, and 22. And so the first announcement is in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, which says this: Now the Lord said to Abram, Go forth from your country, and from your relatives, and from your father's house, to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So Abram then went forth as the Lord had spoken to him. Now notice there are three basic core promises of the Abrahamic Covenant. The promise of land, the promise of what's known as the seed promise. He's promised, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. But also, underlying all of this is God's promise to bless the entire world. In you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now, later on in these lectures, when we've talked about typology, type and antitype, we will see how the Abrahamic Covenant was always from the beginning pointing forward to Jesus Christ and finds its fulfillment in Christ and the church. We will talk about that after we complete the lectures on the basic biblical storyline. So, in any event, Abram receives this covenant, and then it is confirmed in Genesis 26 to Abram's son Isaac, and to Isaac's younger son Jacob in Genesis 28 and in Genesis 35. So, in many respects, it's the Abrahamic Covenant that sets the theological background for the rest of the Bible. The Abrahamic covenant is fleshed out throughout the rest of the Bible. So we said with the covenant with Noah, that was like setting the stage, setting the scene, enabling all these other covenants to take place, because you need the stage upon which to enact your drama. But from a theological standpoint, I think the Abrahamic covenant can be viewed as the theological backbone of the entire Bible, because there will be other covenants, the covenant with Moses, the covenant with David, and ultimately the new covenant. These in different ways are fleshing out and making more specific and particular the covenant with Abraham. So it's the importance of the Abrahamic covenant cannot be overstated, and we will be talking about that at some length later on. Now, Abraham and his wife were old and were unable to have children of their own. So God miraculously caused them to conceive and have a son, the son Isaac. Now, again, that demonstrates that God is driving matters. And we've talked about typology. Look at both Abraham and Isaac. Abraham himself is a type of Christ. How? He was told to leave the comfort of his home, his family, and so on, and go to a strange land, a foreign land, where God would show him. The same is true of Christ. Christ left heaven to go to a foreign land, the world, at God's command, because God had a mission for him, just as he had a mission for Abraham. But then look at his son Isaac. Isaac, again, is another type of Christ, pointing to Christ. How? Remember that Isaac, of course, you probably know the story. After Isaac was born, God told Abraham, I want you to go sacrifice your son on the mountain. And so he was 3 days in journey, and he was about to sacrifice his son. But at the last moment, God provided a ram, and so the animal was sacrificed in place of Isaac. Well, likewise, Jesus Christ, not only, he in fact was sacrificed. So the sacrifice of Isaac was not fulfilled, but the ram was substituted. But in the case of Christ, Christ did go to the cross. But look at both Isaac and Jesus were conceived miraculously. Both of them, their births were supernatural. Isaac was the only beloved son, the son of promise. And so there are a number of ways in which, and in a footnote in your book, I list 7 different ways in which Isaac is a type of Christ. So we've seen these things happened in history, and yet because this is God's story, the Bible is God's story, he embeds this typology in the Bible to show that this is much more than history. This is all pointing to Jesus Christ, who is the one who unifies the entire Bible. Now, Isaac had his son Jacob, and Jacob had 12 sons, who ultimately are the progenitors of the 12 tribes of Israel. But Jacob's children, they were living immorally, like the Canaanites among whom they were living. Now, if that continued, there would be no Israel. And therefore, God preserved his chosen people by moving them from Canaan to Egypt. How did he do that? I mean, it's very interesting the way God operates. You may recall that Joseph was one of the sons of Jacob, and his other brothers were jealous of him. And so they sold him into slavery, and he ended up becoming the slave of Potiphar, one of the officials in Egypt. Now, and that's the method that God used. And he was a slave for many years, but he was able to interpret dreams. And at the end, the Pharaoh of Egypt saw this and elevated Joseph to the number 2 position in the entire country of Egypt. Well, later on, because of famine, of course, Joseph's brothers and his dad came to Egypt because they heard that there was bread there. And then when Jacob died, his brothers were afraid that Joseph would enact retribution against them because of what they did. And so, but in Genesis 50, verse 20, Joseph said this, 19 and 20. Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. Therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones." And so he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Now, this tells us something. God acts in history through events and people's actions that appear to us simply to be natural, not supernatural occurrences in order to effect his plan. And God even uses sin. He uses the actions of people because, notice Joseph said, "You meant it for evil against me." What's the it? Selling Joseph into slavery. But God meant it for good. In other words, the brothers had one motive for doing what they did. God didn't say, after they had sold Joseph into slavery, "Oh my, what should I do to bring about good?" No. Joseph says, God meant it for good. God knew what was going on, and the selling into slavery, and he had another motive for ordaining and allowing that to happen. Which is why we need to realize when bad things happen in our lives, God has not abandoned us. It's all a part of his good and loving plan. We may not understand what's going on. We may not like what is going on. But as Jesus said, "I will never leave you or forsake you." And that is an example. I mean, Joseph had to go through very hard times in prison and so on and so forth. And yet it was all part of God's plan. Now, so the 12 brothers and the tribes, they begin in Egypt. They're given a place in Goshen and become shepherds and cattle herders and so on. And there they multiplied greatly. They became a nation in Egypt. And so Exodus begins with the fact that Israel had multiplied in Egypt, but then in Exodus 1 verse 8 it says, "A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph." And he said, "The people of these sons of Israel are more and mightier than we are. We need to deal wisely with them." So he had a plan to kill all the newborn baby boys and so on and so forth. And again, very similar in Jesus's case, because Herod the king, when he heard that Jesus was the prophesied king and Messiah, he ordered all the newborns 2 years of age and younger to be killed. So again, this typology, again and again and again, we see it. Well, this Exodus begins 400 years after the end of Genesis and the death of Joseph. And so there's this lapse of time, a new king arises, but then God, again, he chooses somebody. He chooses Moses to be the one to deliver Israel out of slavery in Egypt. Now, we see that in the book of Exodus, and then in Leviticus, we will see God tells the people he has these laws and for the building of the tabernacle and the feasts and festivals. This is how you are to live when you enter the land that I will be giving you. Numbers continues the story about the journey, the wandering in the wilderness that had to occur because of Israel's unfaithfulness. And Deuteronomy, Moses instructs Israel how they should live when they enter the land, because Deuteronomy is his last major speech just before Israel enters the land. Now, but again, God is driving the narrative. And so when he appears to Moses in the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3, and he commissions Moses to go to the Pharaoh, to tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And again, a couple of interesting things. Moses says, well, who are you? What's your name? And the Lord says, I am who I am. What he's basically saying is, I am unique. You will know me by what I do. And then, of course, Moses, says, who am I to do this? And I can't speak well, and so on and so forth. And so God says, all right, your brother can go with you. Once again, Abraham's obedience was not immediate and complete. Likewise, Moses, he's talking with God himself, and yet he's afraid. God uses weak, failing, fragile people. Abraham and Moses are no different from you and me. But Aaron, Moses' brother, can be the spokesperson, and so he goes, and as you know, God reveals himself through the 10 plagues, and the plagues really are a way of attacking Egypt's gods. I mean, they had frog gods, so God sends a plague of frogs, and so on and so forth. And so ultimately, the Pharaoh lets the Israelites go, but even then he changes his mind, and so God miraculously parts the Red Sea, and the Egyptian army is then drowned, whereas the Israelites are able to cross dry land to the land where they are going. Now, but God then appears to Moses, and in Exodus 19 through 24, God enters into a covenant with Moses called the Mosaic Covenant. And the Mosaic Covenant, he's on Mount Sinai, and the Mosaic Covenant basically is not only the 10 Commandments, but the different laws that he gives, the Sabbath law and other laws. That's all part of the Mosaic Covenant. The Mosaic Covenant really is, it includes the sacrificial system, the tabernacle, the Sabbath, the feasts, the priesthood, and all of these things are part of the Mosaic Covenant. Because what God is doing is setting Israel apart, and the Mosaic Covenant, which in the New Testament is called the Old Covenant, is essentially saying, this is how you are to act. These are the laws and the regulations you have to follow when you enter the land. And therefore, God has promised to bless Israel, but God's blessings and curses were tied in a physical way to Israel's obedience or disobedience to the law. Because what God was endeavoring to do was to teach Israel the spiritual principle, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord, am holy. And therefore, the Mosaic Covenant is rather different than the other covenants. It's kind of a conditional. If you obey, I will bless you. If you don't, I will curse you. It's tied to their obedience in a way that the Abrahamic covenant was not. In the Abrahamic covenant, God made these promises, and they were not conditioned upon Abraham's obedience or disobedience. And we'll see the same is true with the covenants with David and the new covenant. So the Mosaic covenant was somewhat different. It was longer. and it instituted all of these institutions, the tabernacle, the priesthood, and so on and so forth. But again, notice, part and parcel, really at the heart of the Mosaic covenant, is the Ten Commandments, which are found in Deuteronomy 5 and in Exodus 20. I said earlier that the way God operates is through his grace. He initiates things. And notice how the Ten Commandments begin. In Exodus 20, verse 1 and 2, it says, "Then God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." Then verse 3, "You shall have no other gods before me." And then it goes on with the other commandments. What's he saying? Notice, he's putting his grace. I brought you out of the land of Egypt. Grace is first, and only after that comes the law. And notice something very important. The first commandment is, "You shall have no other gods before me." In other words, that is the command against idolatry. Because idolatry, an idol, is anything or anyone that a person puts over God. And Martin Luther said, and I think said very correctly, if you violate any of the other commandments, you are also violating the first commandment. In other words, if you steal something, thou shalt not steal, you're putting that thing over obedience to God. If you commit adultery, thou shalt not commit adultery, you're putting that person and your physical pleasure over and above your love to God. So, yes, if you steal, you're a thief. If you commit an adultery, you're an adulterer. But it also is showing that you are an idolater. Idolatry, I think, is probably the root of all sins. And interestingly enough, when Moses was on the mountain receiving the commandments and the covenant, Israel fell into sin, violating the very things that the Ten Commandments prohibited. And so, but God did not wipe them out. Moses intervened. God spared the people, gave Moses another set of the commandments on stone. But as a result, Israel wandered in the wilderness for 40 years until that generation was dead. And so the new generation was able to enter the land. Now, in the next step of the process is Israel entering the land in the book of Joshua. And again, in Joshua, the book of Joshua through 1 Samuel 7, it has Israel in the land, now being ruled by judges. But once again, Joshua is a type of Christ. We see that in the fact that the Hebrew for Joshua is Yehoshua or Yeshua, which is the same name in English as Jesus. And in the book of Hebrews, Hebrews 4, verses 4 and 8, the same Greek word for Joshua, Iesus, is used both for Joshua and for Jesus. More importantly, Joshua led the people to victory over their enemies and entered the promised land. Jesus defeated our greatest enemies, sin, Satan, and death itself, so that we could enter the ultimate promised land of eternal life. But interestingly, in Hebrews 4, it said that Joshua did not give his people the true rest. The true rest is found only in the antitype, namely Jesus Christ. Because remember, a type is a physical thing or person that points to something greater than itself. And so the physical entering the land under Joshua was a physical type, but it is not as great as the true rest that Jesus gives us. And the enemies that Joshua defeated are nothing compared to the enemies that Jesus defeated. But so they enter the land, but once again, the people, they fall into disbelief and disobedience, and so then one group oppresses them until they cry out, and then God in his grace and mercy raises up a judge, and throws off the oppressors. The cycle repeats itself and repeats itself until we get to the book of 1 Samuel. And in Samuel was the last great judge, as well as a priest and a prophet. But the people in 1 Samuel 8, they demanded a king so that they could be just like the other nations. Now, there had been some pro-king passages in the book of Genesis and in Deuteronomy, and also some anti-king passages. But the people wanted a king not to honor God, but so that we could be like all the other nations, according to 1 Samuel 8, verse 20. So in other words, and God told Samuel, they're not rejecting you, their judge. They are rejecting me. This is always the way. This was true in the Tower of Babel. This has been true throughout history. And to one degree or another, it is true in our individual lives as well. They got a king, and of course the greatest king, the first king was Saul. After that was David, and then finally was Solomon. But God entered into, the greatest king, of course, was King David. And once again, God entered into a covenant with David. And it says, that's found in 2 Samuel chapter 7, where David said, I want to build a temple or a house for you. And God said, no, you are a man of blood. Your son, Solomon, will build a temple. But then he says that in the Davidic covenant, it says that I will establish your throne. I will make your name great, like the names of the great men who are on the earth. I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them. Again, notice, these things are repeating the kind of promises that God had made to Abraham. And it says that I will give you rest from all of your enemies, and I will raise up a descendant after you. 2 Samuel 7, verse 12, who will come forth from you. I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for me. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. Now, again, that Davidic kingdom, it not only alluded to the promises that God had made to Abraham, but in promising an everlasting kingdom and a throne, that goes far beyond Solomon, and it goes far beyond David's line. That, again, is pointing to Jesus. And so when it says, I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me, when we hear the phrase, Jesus is the Son of God, in one sense, of course, that is pointing to the Trinity. But in another sense, it's saying that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant. And so the initial physical fulfillment is found in Solomon. But again, these covenants are pointing far beyond the physical and the temporal. They find their ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ. And we will talk more about the Davidic covenant later on. Finally, let me conclude this lecture by saying that we also have mentioning the wisdom literature, the books of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. Now, wisdom literature basically deals with the quest for knowledge, understanding, and a relationship with God and others in a world where relationships have been restored. So it's basically showing in different ways how we should be living in light of God's presence. But even here, we see in the book of Job, Job himself is a type of Christ, because Jesus is the ultimate Job, because Job suffered. He was called a righteous man, and yet Jesus is the only truly innocent sufferer. Job, it says, was naked. He was in physical pain. Well, Jesus was homeless. He was stripped naked. He was tortured on the cross. So while Job was relatively innocent, Jesus was truly innocent. And so the point of Job's sufferings was whether he would continue to obey God without knowing, what the results would be. But Jesus did obey God all the way to the end, knowing what was going to happen to him, knowing that he was going to face excruciating physical death, but also that he would be separated from the Father, which is the essence of hell. So again, Jesus is the greater Job. We will continue the story of redemption in the next lecture.